greatness made limitless. That's Life Unlimited.
We said we'd never break the 3-second rule. Never do that. And never become a minivan mom.
Hey, Chris.
As parents, we say never a lot, but never happens. So when you say you'd never leave your child in a hot car, know it can happen. Before you leave the car, always stop, look, lock.
I'm Josh Robin. Here's your Spectrum News. Good day, I'm Josh Robin. You're watching a special report here on Spectrum News. It is now 1 p.m. in the nation's capital, and that's where a joint session of Congress will soon certify the results of the presidential election. This is a largely ceremonial session, but it was anything but 4 years ago. Then President Donald Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, as you may recall, to try and prevent Congress from certifying the results of Joe Biden's victory. Vice President Kamala Harris, who lost the election to Trump, will today preside over a joint session that will affirm that Trump has won again. Washington reporter Evan Kosloff joining us live on Capitol Hill for us. So Evan, in the years past, this was kind of pro forma, and 4 years ago, people quickly learned that Congress has a major role to play in certifying the election, and now here we are 4 years later. Can you walk us through what we're expecting over the next hour in the Capitol?
Right, you're absolutely right that walking into this some 4 years ago, we thought this was just going to be a routine part of the process. And let me break it down. It's outlined in the 12th Amendment, and essentially here's what happens. We have all these state elections that happened back in November, and now this is when federal lawmakers are going to formally certify those results that come in. You brought up one point, which is interesting here, which is that Vice President Kamala Harris is going to be there receiving those tallies. That's because she is the vice president, and so it's her job as the leader of the Senate. It's a piece of irony, of course, because she lost the presidential election to President-elect Donald Trump. But so she's going to take in those results, and then they're going to give them out to what are called tellers. There are 2 in the House, 2 from the Senate. You can see right now on your screen that they've got this joint session of Congress, and it's basically going to be them that counts the total. They're going to tally the vote, and they're going to, in the end, decide that, yes, President-elect Donald Trump did win the presidential election. It is ceremonious, and that's why it was so shocking some 4 years ago when it was disrupted in the way that it was. There were some challenges, and that is part of the process, that you can challenge the results of those state elections. In fact, 4 years ago, there were challenges in 2 of those states. However, they were unsuccessful. The bigger story 4 years ago was not what was happening in the chamber, though, of course, but what was happening outside of the Capitol, where we had all those protests, Josh, coming in and disrupting it before they did, in the end, certify President Joe Biden there. So we're not expecting anything dramatic like that. This is expected to go smoothly. You can see there in the chamber, all smiles. There are no protests outside. There's a lot of snow. There's a lot of security outside, Josh, and a lot of snow as they come to do this important part of the democratic process, Josh.
Yeah, and some very small hiccups with the feed that might have to do with the weather. Alex, let's bring you in. Obviously, people there, well, for one thing, they're not wearing masks like they were 4 years ago, but there is a big difference. I wonder if people in the Capitol and around the country are remembering what happened 4 years ago, or is that really water under the proverbial bridge?
Well, I think Democrats are doing their best on this day to make sure that Americans remember exactly what transpired just 4 years ago. Andy Kim of New Jersey has been today posting on social media these side-by-side images of what he saw 4 years ago, a sea of protesters, Trump supporters storming the building, contrasted with halls that are looking almost empty today. And I think even the New York Times right now comparing moment-by-moment video of what the nation's capital looked like just 4 years ago and what it looks like today, to really try to remind folks of exactly what happened. And I think the reason for this is because, look, 4 years is a long time. So much has happened, and we live in a world where our media ecosystems are so very fractured that even though we all experienced the same day, we all experienced it in such remarkably different days. And we've seen a lot of attempts by Donald Trump and by Republicans to try to sanitize the violence that we saw there. Many talking about peaceful visitors, tourists even, to the Capitol on that day, and no mention at all of the blood that was shed, the lives that were lost. And I think it's very important for Democrats to remind the public, yes, we are certifying this election. Yes, Donald Trump won, but that doesn't erase what happened here just 4 years ago, Josh.
Well, Taylor, let's bring you in. Taylor Popolars, you were there. I flew in that night from Atlanta, and I wanted to ask you, I think it's a nonpartisan issue to just have the history straight of what actually happened 4 years ago. Can you give us a little sense as to what it looked like on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, it was an incredibly chaotic day. At times, it was really frightening. It was stressful. To paint the picture, as you alluded to, we were still in the throes of the pandemic, but a good deal of reporters, congressional staffers, people who keep the Capitol complex running were there and were present that day. We were set up in one of the House office buildings where we had a camera in place, but then, as you see this video that's playing, this is all video I shot that day 4 years ago. We got evacuated from our initial live location because at the time there were believed to be bomb threats going on. And then that evacuation turned into a 4-hour-long period of being essentially locked in a hallway with dozens of other people in one of the House office buildings, the Longworth building. And then, as you could see, we had lawmakers rushing by us as they were evacuated from the House floor. There were police officers who were clearly injured, who were getting taken away from the Capitol building itself. And there were other officers very heavily armed who were rushing back into the Capitol. So we were trying to piece together what was happening on our phones because we were not outside seeing what was happening as the building was actually getting broken into, but we were getting updates and we were seeing kind of the aftermath of it in person. I remember lawmakers had gas masks on that they were given on the House floor. One lawmaker had a health episode and was pushed by several police officers in a rolling chair down the hallway. The officers had their weapons drawn. It was incredibly tense. Family and friends were reaching out throughout the day because they were watching the images unfold. And for the people who were inside the Capitol building itself, they were dealing with a much scarier situation where windows were being broken, furniture was being destroyed, offices were being broken into. It was really chaotic, and it was a lot and a sad day.
Let's take a look down at the floor of the House of Representatives.
Mr. Speaker,
we'll just listen in for a bit.
Congress, pursuant to the Constitution and laws of the United States, the Senate and House of Representatives are meeting in joint session to verify the certificates and count the votes of the electors of the several states for President and Vice President of the United States. After ascertainment has been had that the certificates are authentic and correct in form, the tellers will count and make a list of the votes cast by the electors of the several states. The tellers on the part of the two houses will take their places at the clerk's desk. Without objection, the tellers will dispense with reading formal portions of the certificates After ascertaining that the certificates are regular in form and authentic, the tellers will announce the votes cast by the electors for each state, beginning with Alabama. Senator Fisher.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Alabama seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 9 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 9 votes for vice president.
Well, you can see where this is going.
Madam President, the certificate
Alabama has gone for Donald Trump. This is very much pro forma. And if my math serves, this is going to be done actually 50 more times because we'll count Washington, D.C., and on it will go. It's a good opportunity to bring in the panel of political experts who are joining me today. And Evan, let me ask you something. This is actually in a way that maybe people won't notice, but in an extremely important way, different than 4 years ago in how it actually is, the process has changed. Obviously, it's not chaotic. There aren't rioters trying to break into the Capitol. Something has changed in that Congress has changed how this whole electoral count is done, making it much less easy to rig, I would say. Let me have you explain a little bit about what the reforms were to the Electoral Count Act.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral
Right. So in the end, the institutions did hold, but I think there was a lot of concern after what we saw on January 6, 2021, that wouldn't be the case. And that's why they had these initiatives to try and change the electoral rules, counting rules, essentially. The biggest one is that it made it very clear explicitly that the vice president's role here is solely ceremonial. So this is not, there's a lot of pressure on then Vice President Pence to reject the results, and there was, in the end, of course, he did not do so. But now they wanted to make it more clear in the writing of the law that it is just ceremonial, and so, the words they used were solely ministerial. So that was one big change. But then there were also changes to the process of challenging the results. In the past, it could be just one representative from the House or the Senate that could challenge the results for a state and then bring it up for a vote. Instead, now it's been changed to 1/5 of the House and 1/5 of the Senate, also making it more strict, the rules for what would be grounds for challenging the results. These are just changes that were made on a bipartisan effort to try and safeguard the democratic institutions after what we saw in 2021. So definitely big changes made there. We're not seeing any of that. It's expected that we won't see any challenges at all today, but that will be something to keep an eye on, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make the argument, Evan, that's the most important thing that Congress did over the last 4 years. I mean, taxes go higher, they go lower. There's investment in infrastructure that happens, that doesn't happen. But this is really codifying how we process democracy, how we actually do this thing. Alex, let me bring you in and talk about Mike Pence, because it was a very, very different scene 4 years ago. The man they were calling for his death.
Authentic, and it appears therefrom.
That they were. And again, I think this goes to what we spoke about earlier, reminding people exactly what took place on that day. Mike Pence, I think, was put in an extraordinary, difficult position. His boss, then President Donald Trump, saying, do not do this, do not certify the election. And yet I think Mike Pence is still feeling that call of duty. This is what the election results were. He knew that he had to uphold them. And I think we're listening to this here now.
California received 3 votes for president, and Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota received 3 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Florida seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 30 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 30 votes for vice president.
So Florida has just gone for Donald Trump. I mean, this is just codifying what we have long known, that Trump's adopted state went for him over Kamala Harris. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the comparison of 4 years ago to today and to the elections of 2024 versus 2020. Taylor, you spent an awful lot of time on the stump, and I think many people after the 6th of January 2020 were writing off Donald Trump. 2021, I should say. He was persona non grata. He left. He ended up being impeached once again. He ended up being acquitted, and he went back to Mar-a-Lago. And then obviously a lot has changed since then. He's coming back, and now we're certifying his re-election, albeit a term later. Why were people, and obviously I think books will be written about this, but in your opinion now, and your analysis now, why were people not more swayed that he was a threat to the very fabric of the democratic republic nature of our country, and that other issues were more important?
You know, Josh, I think a lot of it has to do with time. You know, we're talking about an event that unfolded 4 years ago, which is a good deal of time. And over time, I saw in my conversations with hundreds of voters across the country, over 24 states that I visited, by the end of the election of 2024, people were focused on economic issues and on the border and on crime and safety. Early on in early 2023, let's say, or mid-2023, when Joe Biden was still running for re-election, there was a lot more talk on the trail about January 6th because that was a key kind of pillar of his campaign, talking about how Donald Trump was, in his opinion, a threat to democracy, trying to remind voters of it. When Kamala Harris had to enter the race at the last minute with 107 days left, her campaign made a decision to focus more on pocketbook issues because at that point they saw voters had kind of shifted their needs to that. But if you rewind to 2022 and to 2021, right after the attack unfolded, Donald Trump in many ways entered political exile. He refused to attend Joe Biden's inauguration. That was just a few days after the attack. He went down to his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida, and no one really talked to him other than a handful of Republicans, including then House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, who went to visit him. But the day after January 6th, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle were furious with Trump. They were blaming him. Then Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell expressly said that in a speech. And a lot of lawmakers were ready to move on because they were, one, terrified about what had happened at their workplace, and they felt in danger. Their families had been threatened. Security was really tightened. And they also didn't see that there was a way to come back for Trump politically. But over the course of a year and a half, Trump, stayed quiet for a couple of months. But as he decided then he was going to run for re-election for a third time, he really decided to kind of just gloss over what happened on January 6th and in many ways whitewash it. I went to dozens of his rallies, and he would say that it was a beautiful day. He would insist that there was no violence. He would insist that the election was stolen, even though there's still no evidence to support that. And he regularly campaigned on, even as we're preparing in his presidential transition for him to take office again, to pardon a lot of the people who have been convicted of crimes for attacking the Capitol. And that's something that started to resonate with at least his supporters. So I think what's fascinating is, had another election happen maybe a year after January 6, 2021, I think the public would have felt a lot differently compared to how they felt in fall 2024. I talked to a lot of people about January 6 as I was traveling, and many people told me, not just Republicans, that they didn't believe that there was violence on that day, that they didn't believe the Capitol building had been broken into and that there was damage. So I oftentimes would pull out my phone and show some of the videos and photos that we were playing before that I took that day, and just politely tried to show people, like, hey, here's what I saw. It's a reflection of how people get their information these days and how that changes things, but also how people in many ways were kind of willing to move on from this really tragic day where you saw over 140 police officers get injured. Several people died in connection to this day for various reasons, including one rioter who was shot and killed by police. Several police officers died by suicide. So this was a tragic event that really changed Washington and Capitol Hill. But across the country, I found a lot of people were in many ways willing to move on from it.
I always thought that Kevin McCarthy visiting Trump at Mar-a-Lago in the days after the 6th of January 2021 was really the pivotal moment. If he hadn't gone, then what would have happened to Donald Trump? But obviously he did, and here we are today. Taylor was mentioning all of these individuals who have been convicted or have pleaded guilty to crimes. Do you have any sense, Evan, as to not necessarily the specific numbers, but where things stand with the convictions of those rioters, those insurrectionists?
President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts seems to be
January 6, 2021. It's developed into one of the largest investigations of the Department of Justice history. In fact, the number is more than 1,500 people that have been charged in connection to actions taken that day. Many of them were for misdemeanors just for entering the Capitol, but there were others that faced charges for acts of violence, felony acts of violence that happened on that day. 250 were convicted of crimes, over 1,000 pled guilty, and over 700 of those people faced some jail time, and that included some notable people. So there were, of course, the folks that just came in and entered, but there were others that faced charges for seditious conspiracy, for example, including the chairman of the Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio, serving a 22-year sentence, and the founder of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rose, who's facing 18-year sentence. So there are some people that are facing really serious charges for what they did on January 6, 2021. And then the big question as we move forward now is, of course, President-elect Donald Trump will soon have the pardon power once he takes office, and he has called many of the people that were here on January 6 patriots. Other times he's called them hostages, and he's promised to issue wide-scale pardons for many of the people that were here on January 6. And so the big question is, who exactly is he referring to when he says he's going to issue these pardons? Is it going to be the people facing the misdemeanors for coming in, or is it going to be those that had acts of violence on that day? Will it be those notable figures that, like Tarrio, that entered here at the Capitol or faced charges for seditious conspiracy? That's the big question moving forward. We don't quite know, but that's going to be something that he's going to visit, he said, on day one. So we're going to have to watch for that, Josh.
Well, Alex, one thing we can say is it doesn't appear that Donald Trump is facing charges anytime soon. He was charged federally and locally, and
it appears
now he's not about to take the oath as a defendant. He's about to take the oath as president.
Ohio received 10 votes.
That's correct. Not just in this circumstance, but so many of the charges that Donald Trump has faced has really tested the limits of both the American judicial system and American democracy. Of course, there were charges that Donald Trump was the one who incited these rioters to storm the Capitol building. But it was a very difficult situation to prove. Once again, as Taylor mentioned, this is almost this Rashomon-like situation where some people definitely saw this as a very violent day, where people seem to be moved by the words Donald Trump calling people to be there on this day. It will be wild is the phrase that many folks remember, but others just saw this as people who happened to wander into the building without any obstruction whatsoever. So it's a very different scenario. And of course, once it became clear as we got closer and closer to the 2024 election, it was very clear that people were concerned about whether or not a president, former than returning, should be facing criminal charges. And so once again, I think it'll be very interesting to kind of compare and contrast the sentences. Oftentimes the same judge, Tanya Chutkan, who was I just heard this morning an interview with a young man who was on the lam. He was there on January 6th. A Vietnamese man who believed that Donald Trump was robbed the election, and he came out to show his support, and he was eventually convicted. And because of the fact that he posted socially on social media and had texted folks with some very threatening, violent messages, he received a very harsh sentence, and then he didn't show up to his sentencing date, so he's not facing them in no small part because he feels that Donald Trump will just pardon him. So why would he show up for a sentence anyway? It's very interesting to see here who the law applies to, who it doesn't. And I think the big question now is, will, in fact, Donald Trump do as he said and pardon many of the people who showed up on that day?
What is the president-elect saying?
He has said that he will pardon many of those. He said different things to different people when he's been asked by the media about, is this, a blatant pardon for everyone? I think he's been somewhat cautious because of the fact that there are some people who it might look very bad given the extent of the things that they did. I mean, let's remember there was blood, there was feces that was smeared in the Capitol that day, people who were never supposed to be allowed into that building, a very ominous violent threats, as we've discussed, and there are people whose lives were lost. I think it wouldn't be a very good look for Donald Trump's legacy if he were to pardon some of those folks. But there are folks who received much lighter sentences because their involvement was much more minimal, much more of a breaking and entering situation. And I think it's very safe to say that he will pardon many of those. I think another key thing to think about here, Josh, is the words that Donald Trump has used to describe these people. If you go back and look to January of 2021 in the immediate aftermath of this incident, even Donald Trump himself was critical and said those who broke the law will be brought to justice. But over time, we've watched as the language and the rhetoric has evolved, the fact that he now refers to many of those folks as hostages, a very, very different word. The fact that he has appeared while hearing the J6 choir singing, I think shows that he's been able to really reshape the narrative around these folks. And there's been plenty of reporting that he's been in direct conversation with many of those folks, reassuring him, don't worry, I've got your back, which has been true of many of the people who have faced severe punishment for what happened that day. And many times justified, I think many Americans would say, punishment for that day. And I think that's what Donald Trump will really wrestle with. There's been extensive polling that shows that those who stormed the Capitol that day should be serving time. Does Donald Trump heed those polls or not, I think will be a difficult question for him, Josh.
Well, Taylor, let me ask you this. Trump apparently has been taking to social media just as we're talking. What's he been saying?
So he's been posting on his Truth Social platform throughout the day. He's down at his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida, where he's been spending most of this transition process. He sent out a message about 4 hours ago in all caps that reads, "Congress certifies our great election victory today, a big moment in history, MAGA for Make America Great Again." And then in a separate post, he just posted a photo of the crowd that showed up to his rally at the Ellipse 4 years ago today, before a portion of that crowd moved down to the Capitol and stormed into the building. Time and time again, Trump has talked about how, in his opinion, that was the largest crowd that he ever spoke before, that it was a beautiful day, and he's largely cheered on what took place on January 6th, albeit for a couple moments that day 4 years ago and the day after, where he condemned some of the violence and called for his supporters to eventually go home. But he's, in many ways today, just continuing the messaging. What's, of course, notable, though, is that 4 years ago, he was refusing to acknowledge what is normally, as we're seeing, a very mundane process play out, because Joe Biden won and Trump lost, and he was unwilling to acknowledge that. So he coaxed a lot of his supporters to show up to D.C. and then at one point said he was going to march down to the Capitol with them. So today he is fully accepting the results, and he is happily doing that. We talked about this on election night, where Trump made a few baseless claims on election night just a couple of months ago about fraud, but then when it became clear he was winning, that quieted. So this is, of course, a big change from 4 years ago, but the fact that Trump won this election seems to indicate his kind of approval of the day and celebrating it, right, compared to what we saw 4 years ago when he wasn't willing to accept reality in many ways.
Taylor, let's go to the House floor just for a moment and see where we are stateswise and get a little sense as to what these lawmakers are doing on a very, very important day, a day that is going according to plan.
Madam President, the certificate of the
ago.
electoral vote of the state of Rhode Island seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Kamala D. Harris of the state of California received 4 votes for president, and Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota received 4 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of South Carolina seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 9 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 9 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of South Dakota seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 3 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 3 votes for vice president.
All right, we're getting close. I want to get in one more question to Taylor, I think, before we take the end of this.
Madam President,
Taylor, you've been covering Donald Trump for a very long time, and I'm not going to hold you to it, but do you have a sense as to whether he will pardon the people who were involved in this rioting 4 years ago?
Trump of the state of Florida.
Oh, I certainly think he'll pardon at least some of them, if not all of them. I mean, you have to remember, he kicked off his re-election bid in mid-2023 with a rally down in Waco, Texas, which of course was the site of a famous kind of anti-government massacre as the government tried to go in on the Branch Davidians and break up that cult. And Trump went there and started the rally by playing what's become known as the J6 anthem by the J6 Choir, which is a recording by prisoners here in the D.C. jail singing the national anthem and Trump reciting the Pledge of Allegiance dubbed together. So that's how he kicked off his re-election bid, and he's continued to talk about them for over a year and a half. So he's made very clear that he wants to pardon most, if not all, of these people. And it's worth mentioning that a lot of the folks who are still in the D.C. jail here are the ones who were charged with really violent crimes, attacking police officers. One officer lost an eye in this. Several officers had to retire early because they faced such trauma, both physically and psychologically. And I mentioned earlier, at least 4 police officers died by suicide in the aftermath of this. So that is what stands in contrast to kind of what Trump has been saying. He, of course, managed in this most recent re-election bid to still kind of campaign as a law and order candidate, but he's never acknowledged the police officers that were injured 4 years ago today. He's never met with any of them, at least that we're aware of, and he's continued to insist that a lot of the people still behind bars or those who have already served their time and are out were patriots who showed up for a lie that he was pushing forward. So it's stunning in that sense, but it was a main pillar of his campaign. And like we talked about, people seemed more comfortable focusing on economy issues and pocketbook issues and immigration issues, and this kind of ended up falling to the wayside, except when Trump would mention it specifically about those pardons. I will say, at a lot of his rallies, when he would talk about that, it was a big applause line. So within the Trump base, at least, this is kind of a rallying cry still, much as it was 4 years ago.
Taylor, thank you. We're going to go back to the House floor. We are getting close to the end, and it is going as we had expected, with no objections and with the officialdom that is codifying Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 presidential election. Let's listen in. That's Joe Morelli of upstate New York.
And Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota received 12 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of West Virginia seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 4 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 4 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the great state of Wisconsin seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 10 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 10 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Wyoming seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 3 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 3 votes for vice president.
Members of Congress, the certificates having been read, the tellers will ascertain and deliver the result to the President of the Senate.
The undersigned, Deb Fisher and Amy Klobuchar, tellers on the part of the Senate, and Brian Steele and Joseph Morelli, tellers on the part of the House of Representatives, report the following as the result of the ascertainment and counting of the electoral vote for President and Vice President of the United States for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2025.
The state of the vote for the President of the United States as delivered to the President of the Senate is as follows. The whole number of the electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, the majority is 270. The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 312 votes. Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 226 votes. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for Vice President of the United States are as follows. J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio has received 312 votes. Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota has received 226 votes. This announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for a term beginning on the 20th day of January 2025, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the House and the Senate. Thank you very much.
There you have it. It was simple, it was official, it was perhaps a little bit boring, but it codified democracy. The American people have spoken, and now Congress has accepted those results, unlike it transpired, frankly, in a way that was not the most exciting, but it was exactly how it was supposed to be, unlike 4 years ago, when the loser of the 2020 election, Donald Trump, refused to accept those results against Joe Biden, sparking a deadly riot. We are 4 years from the day when that happened, and Kamala Harris, who lost, of course, this last election, was the one who presided over this codification, and there were no objections. The people have spoken. Their representatives in Congress have written it down. As you see there, J.D. Vance, who is one of the victors, the vice president, shaking hands of individuals, and it was, to put it mildly, an incredibly different outcome than what we saw 4 years ago. I'll bring in my colleagues here, and we'll start with you, Evan Kosloff. Can you explain a bit, for those who might not know, what exactly was Congress doing now? Because Americans voted, it's been months now, so what did Congress have to do with that vote today?
All right, so we have an interesting system here where we have the Electoral College, where really we have a series of state elections, and that's what everybody voted in back in November. And now this is when the federal lawmakers come together in that joint session that we just saw and certify the results of each of those state elections. There was an opportunity to challenge the results if they thought there was any problem. Obviously, we did not see that. So now it's official. They have certified those results from the state elections, opening the door for President-elect Donald Trump to be inaugurated in 2 weeks right here in Washington, D.C. It's worth stopping for just a moment to think about this moment for Vice President Kamala Harris, who has had a wild whirlwind 6 months, going from Vice President, then President Joe Biden dropping out of the race, abruptly starting her campaign to try and win election, and now here she is overseeing the counting of the vote for her opponent, President-elect Donald Trump. So it's been a whirlwind 6 months, really, for her as she just finalized those results there, Josh.
Yeah, Alex, let me turn to you. You've covered Kamala Harris for a long time. What do you think was going through her mind there as she was certifying or presiding over the certification of her loss?
That is a great question, Josh. I could never say what's going on in her mind. I would love to know, like, what she and Doug say over dinner this evening. But, you know, she said to reporters on her way in today that, you know, we have to, I'm paraphrasing here, but, you know, democracy is democracy no matter what. I heard one of her colleagues in the House say today, I do not respect Donald Trump, but I do respect this process. And I'm sure that is what was probably stealing Kamala Harris's nerves as she read today. I thought it was interesting, that last bit at the end where she talked about how many votes Donald Trump had received and how many she had received. She had to kind of stop for a moment as there was this, you know, very loud applause for Donald Trump and she was probably just trying to get through it. I think the big question is now, does she run again in 2028? And dare I say it, but I think it's worth asking, does Donald Trump try to rework the rules so that he can serve a third term? It may sound wild to say, but we've seen some pretty wild things in politics, Josh, lately.
Especially over the last 4 years. Taylor, we only have a couple of moments. Your final thoughts.
Urging to see Congress do its job, and the fact that this was mundane, as we talked about 4 years ago, is a long time, but what happened on that day 4 years ago really changed how this institution operates, how the members interact with each other, and it briefly changed how Donald Trump was viewed by the Republican Party. But a lot of members of his party, especially in Congress, were willing to overlook the violence of that day and ultimately back him again for what was historically one of the biggest political comebacks. And now we're just a few days away from his inauguration, and we'll see if at the top of the list, as he promised, if pardoning the people who attacked this very building 4 years ago will be pardoned.
Okay, well, history unfolding, and I'm so glad that you three joined me for analyzing this. Alex Cohen, Taylor Popolars, Evan Koslov, thank you for your time today. Thanks for watching. I'm Josh Robin. We have more news right now here on Spectrum News.
Welcome back, everyone. Meteorologist Scott Dean with your Weather on the Ones forecast as we head through this new